Day 702 of the Ukrainian War Map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzy here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine. So starting off, we'll take a look at those Russian losses, as currently Russia sits on more than 380,000 military personnel losses, which represents an additional 990 in the past day. Then as for hardware losses, a comparatively smaller day off the back of two ginormous days. But as for today, the losses include 8 tanks, 16 APVs, and 15 artillery. Then we'll head across to the map, start out in Ukraine today, in fact in the Donbass, as Russian forces in the north are still dead set on taking Sinkivka. In fact, more correct to say that it is just beyond the border of the Donbass in the Kharkiv region. And what a grind this location continues to be for them, as most recently, Ukraine's 2nd Mechanized Battalion of the 3rd Mechanized Brigade repelled those attacks just north of the settlement. Russian forces reportedly lost 2 BMP infantry fighting vehicles in this latest attempt. Then briefly moving to Bakhmut, as still being very much an active region for military engagements. Because most recently we saw a Ukrainian SAM team intercepting an incoming Russian Lancet loitering munition with the Swedish supplied RBS-70. Then moving a bit further down on the map, because just outside of a day ago, and worthy of a mention, was how a Ukrainian HIMARS precision rocket hit and destroyed large amounts of manpower and equipment of Russian forces in a strike on a Russian FPV drone training ground in occupied Donetsk. And as it so happened, a member of the Russian crew sent out coordinates of the training ground via an unsecured Telegram channel, which was then picked up by Ukrainian intelligence. Think Bordenov. As such, it was reported that 24 Russian FPV drone operators were eliminated and 4 injured. A popular Russian Telegram channel was also able to corroborate the story. So realistically, we're talking about a bunch of Russian soldiers training for the FPV program, wanting to learn the latest 21st century military tech, only to be made the subject of the efficiency of the 20th century military tech made in the USA. Then moving west briefly to the front lines, as we noticed at Stepova in the north, a Russian infantry assault ran into a Ukrainian Bradley M2 IFV, with the Bradley quickly engaging the Russian formation with its 25mm Bushmaster autocannon fire. So at this point, I just tend to visualize a Bradley M2 just on sentry duty. Then, somewhere in the east, there was the destruction of a more modern Russian T-80 BVM tank variant. That one was pretty close to Crimea, in fact. Then we saw the destruction of a Russian 152mm Mr. S SPG, also in the north near the Kharkiv border. And then, impressively, we saw the destruction of the Russian Morom P thermal imaging surveillance complex, which was actually struck by an FPV drone. Rammed right into it. Then we'll head across to the Zaporizhzhia front lines, as the AFU took a liberation chunk out of the Orikiv axis just northwest of Verbova. Then just across the field, which is in fact a surface area that's larger than Bakhmut or Avdiivka in size, Ukrainian forces repelled 3 assaults southeast of Robotina. So then we'll move across to the Kherson Oblast, as there's really been a lot of ongoing activity here, as Russian forces on the ground are clearly getting the word from their upper command to eradicate the Ukrainian bridgehead presence found at multiple locations along the south bank of the river. And wave after wave of Russian infantry and vehicles are getting destroyed still, by way of Ukrainian FPV drones, particularly at locations such as Krinky and Oleshki. But somewhere along the lines of communication between the Russian assault forces on the ground and the Russian MOD, there is a clear disconnect because we can generally see that these Russian forces are going headfirst in smaller units, one after the other, only to seemingly find out that they have to contend with, well, by and large, those Ukrainian drones. So it is a rather bizarre set of ongoing circumstances. And I don't think it's unfair to say that the Russian military should be able to eliminate enemy bridgeheads on an otherwise completely occupied piece of land. Then, since we're moderately close enough to the north, the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have recently planned a common defense zone on the Russian border, encompassing bunkers, fences, trenches, lookouts, and other various anti-mobility defensive measures. In the event of Russian aggression, where the Kremlin feels like it can switch gears to quickly take one of these countries instead. And yes, they are all NATO countries, and Article 5 would certainly be triggered. However, that doesn't necessarily stop the Kremlin from making some poorly calculated military decisions, as they always do. Because they'd attack as soon as they think they can get away with it, as soon as they think they can get away with anything. As they have a very real tendency to get lost in their own echo chamber of BS, making them believe some Kremlin-produced ideas about delegitimizing the Baltic states, their right to NATO ascension 20 years ago, then having the strength to invade successfully. So sometimes you just have to protect yourself from an idiotic bully. So kudos to you, Baltic states. Then headed across to some news for today. So France delivered 2 additional Mars 2 MLRS-2 M270s to Ukraine. And as a brief refresher, these vehicles are similar to the HIMARS platforms in that they both fire the incredibly successful 88km ranged high-precision GMLRS rockets. However, the Mars 2 house an extra 6-pod of rockets, and they run on the tracked wheels, which is great for a variety of terrains, especially at this time of year, whereas HIMARS is extremely mobile, as they say, on the 6x6 wheeler trucks, enabling them to travel extremely fast up highways to make it to other destinations as needed, to almost feel like it's in 2 places at once. So ultimately, it depends on the mission for the operational requirements for the platform chosen. And as for some further context, Ukraine has 12 of these Mars 2 platforms now, and 20 of the HIMARS, which were met with some incredible success on the battlefield, leading to memes like these ones, due to a Polish order for 486 HIMARS launches from Lockheed Martin after they served a pretty incredible advertisement campaign of sorts after their introduction into Ukraine due to their effectiveness against Russian positions. Then in some other hardware news, Germany has announced its 2024 round of support military aid for Ukraine, including more air defense systems such as the IRIS-T and Gepard air guns, more artillery systems with just under 250,000 artillery shells, although I don't expect all of those to be the 155mm shells. Then also 80 plus Leopard 1A5 block tanks, and other various inclusions such as APCs, drones, armored vehicles, and radar systems. And it might feel like this 2024 package from Germany is somewhat lacking, and it probably is, although this will be separate to the larger package from the coalition of European nations, otherwise known as the EU, which is certainly expected to be a lot larger in size and come in soon. Then compound that with individual nations' contributions, not to mention F-16s and all of those longer-ranged drone platforms, then we're quite likely to see Russia's ability to wage war severely decreased in 2024. Then squeezing in some fresh Russian hardware news briefly, and I might firstly start by asking the question, are there any suggestions on what to call it when Russia makes something, but then they corrupt the crap out of it? As, for instance, there was a recent interesting post from a Russian Telegram channel claiming an increase in Russian drone production, although the quality went down massively, or in their words, fatally, and that it's been lacking any sort of innovation due to a heavily centralized production process that doesn't work with any sort of a feedback loop from the frontliners. And it's not just me speculating on corruption either, although that would be a fair enough assessment. It's also the telegrammer himself, flat out stating the theft, the fraud, the kickbacks, and, quote, the deliberate production of crap. And in the end, he's actually quite concerned about the obsolescence of the hardware that they're receiving through. Then, in some really breaking news, Igor Girkin has been sentenced to 4 years and 11 months in prison. Now, this guy has a rap sheet longer than I could ever mention, but I'll try, as he's the former defense minister of the Donbass, known for leading Russian forces during Crimea's annexation as well, and being implicated as the main war criminal in the 2014 MH17 shooting down over the Donbass. But he was also recognized for his open criticism of Russian military operations, and that's kind of the point, really. His open criticism of the Russian military has led him down the path of the Kremlin labeling him as an extremist, thus accounting for his newly announced 5-year sentence in the Gulag. Well, not the Gulag, but probably close enough to it. So here we have yet another example of Putin cracking down on dissident behavior against the Kremlin. Now, Girkin considers himself a Russian patriot, as do many others within Russian society, as we could see with many of his supporters picketing outside the Moscow city court and jumping on authorities with accusations. And if you don't know Girkin's backstory that well, then in a bizarre twist of a situation, or in a classic Russian twist of a situation, I should say, almost everything that Girkin said about the failings and flaws of the Russian military were pretty accurate. Which again goes to show the systemically rooted problems of the Russian army that will only accept good news and good reports. So it's not much of an incentive for middle-ranking Russian commanders, say, to work within this framework, really. So the option is to just say good things by reporting a rosy picture, or get fired and go to jail. If you're lucky. There's also the case of tea or window, or the case of a surface-to-air missile shooting down your private jet. Then moving across to a Russian military mobilization blunder segment, or at least an adjacent segment, as the Russian government has halted pardons for prisoners sent to fight in Ukraine, now requiring them to serve until the end of their so-called special military operation. Now, these prisoners, initially recruited by Wagner's Prigozhin way back before his departure, were promised pardons and payment after 6 months on the front lines, but do note, something like 90% of them never made it back home from Ukraine. However, now, current Russian policy dictates the release and receiving of state awards only after the war ends. So the larger point here is that these are continued acts of mobilization desperation on the Kremlin's part as they continue to find whoever they justifiably can to ensure the plugging of the frontline gaps without too much affecting the major city centers of the country, for fear of an angry mob backlash in the Red Square or indeed right at the walls of the Kremlin. Then moving on, as I'll round out the video with some really seemingly lowbrow, cheap shot funnies today, as they tend to build up for me, and I don't have a really direct relevance to the war always, but sometimes there is. But here we go anyway. So as for the first one. So this is what some new women's bathrooms look like, which were installed in a new skating rink in Koryazma, which is just about 600 kilometers northeast of Moscow. So, no stalls, no privacy, no class, and even no toilet paper except for the outer edges. So that'd be an awkward situation when the bathrooms fill up right after lunchtime. But I shouldn't be so quick to judge, should I? After all, this could be an upgrade for the roughly 25% of the population that normally do without. Then, as for another one of these funnies, it looks like Mother Russia provides her soldiers the best comforts and sleep-in solutions in Russian barracks before they're shipped off to Ukraine. Except that it looks like Ivan and Sergei kind of have to bunk together. Then, as for a final one of these, it seems that a Russian public transport bus's heating failed, thereby freezing the doors shut. But fear not, as it does turn out that Russia does, in fact, wield the technology of fire and newspaper, all in an effort to make sure the buses run on time. But hey, none of these I've just mentioned are lowbrow cheap shots. Instead, they just happen to be Russian realities. Ooh, I like that one. So thanks again for watching, guys. Please continue to like and comment. Thanks for all of that support, and I do hope to see all of you guys there in the next one. Cheers.